Okay, so last time we talked about the different types of T cells and the B cells. Again, they're responsible for what we call antibody-mediated immunity, or humoral. The T cells are responsible for cell-mediated, but they both form memory cells, T and B cells. So that is what is responsible for what we call immunity. It's not that that you don't respond that next time. It's just that that next response is so quick and dramatic that you don't even know you're infected that second time. So that's immunity. And then we had this group called natural killer cells that attack foreign cells, virus-infected body cells, and cancer cells. So they're a little bit different. So they attack your own cells, but there's a reason for it. And they're responsible for immune surveillance, so they're going throughout the lymphatic system and other tissues looking for the foreign materials. So let's talk about lymphocyte production. It involves the red bone marrow and the thymus and the peripheral lymphoid tissues. And maintaining the normal lymphocyte population is the primary role of the red bone marrow. The hematopoietic stem cells in the red bone marrow do produce lymphoid stem cells, in addition to the red blood cell stem cells. The lymphoid stem cells will produce all the lymphocyte types. One of the groups will go to the thymus, they develop into T cells, and I believe we talked about that last time. And the second group stays in the red bone marrow and divides to produce B cells. And they will mature and move into the lymph nodes and the spleen and the other lymphoid tissues. I mentioned to you that we call T cells because they do mature in the thymus. B cells are not called B cells because they mature in bone marrow, but because of where they were discovered in the bursa fabricius. Natural killer cells mature and migrate throughout your body, and they patrol the peripheral tissues. So if we look specifically at the development of the stem cells in the thymus, the ones that will become T cells, they're basically isolated from the circulation by what we call the blood-thymus barrier. And they'll divide when you have thymic hormones that are produced, and all types of T cells will start being formed. The T cells will undergo selection processes so that you will not react to your own normal body cells. And we mentioned this last time too, up to 98% of the T cells are deselected. And then the mature T cells will re-enter bloodstream. The ones that will not react against your own cells, they'll move to the peripheral lymphoid tissue, so they're going to go to other organs of the lymphatic system, but mainly to lymph nodes, which is something those of you that were in the last lab learned about. Okay, the T cells and B cells all migrate from their sites of origin, but they always retain the ability to divide at this point. So they will produce daughter cells of the same type. B cells will produce more B cells. And this is very important if we are going to maintain an immune response, that they can continue to proliferate by themselves. We don't have to rely on lymphopoiesis or the stem cells. So your lymphoid tissues are any connective tissues that are dominated by the lymphocytes. You have lymphoid nodules, which are densely packed lymphocytes in certain areas of your areolar tissue. The nodules sometimes cluster together and form larger masses. Now, in these masses, we don't have a fibrous capsule like we do with the spleen or an actual lymph node. But the lymphoid organs are separated from the tissues by a fibrous connective tissue capsule. Here's some examples of lymphoid nodules. The aggregated lymphoid nodules are Peyer's patches. These are the clusters that are deep to the epithelial lining of the intestines. Each of them Each of the nodules has a central area called the germinal center that has lots of dividing lymphocytes. Mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. They protect the epithelium of digestive, respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts from the pathogens and toxins. Okay, so basically areas that could come into contact with external environments. Okay, the tonsils, something you might be very familiar with. These are lymphoid nodules in the walls of the pharynx. The pharyngeal tonsils, also called adenoids, they're on the posterior superior wall of the nasopharynx. The palatine tonsils on the left and right sides at the posterior inferior margin of the oral cavity along the boundary of the pharynx. The lingual tonsils, these are pairs of tonsils located deep to the epithelium that cover the base of the tongue. How many of you have had tonsillitis, inflammation of tonsils? How many of you have had them removed? A few of you. So they don't always automatically remove them now because we know they have some good effects. Okay, so this graphic shows where the pharyngeal tonsils are, the palatine tonsils, the lingual tonsils. Lymph nodes. So this is different than the nodules. These are actually lymphoid organs because they have a fibrous connective tissue capsule. Their shape is like a kidney bean. They're about 1 inch in diameter. The large lymph nodes are the lymph glands. These are located in the neck, the groin, and the axilla. They basically function like filters. They remove 99% of the pathogens from the lymph before the fluid returns to the bloodstream. And we actually, in this area, slow the movement of lymph through them on purpose so that your lymphocytes and macrophages have time to identify the foreign pathogens as it comes through the lymph glands, the lymph nodes. The trabeculae, these are fibrous partitions that extend inward from the capsule. Okay, so we have afferent lymphatics that bring the lymph into the node. These are on the opposite side from the hilum. So this indentation here at the top is the hilum. And this is where you have some arteries and vein, or an artery and vein coming in, and also where you have the lymphatics. But here's the afferent lymphatic. This brings lymph into the node, so that is the opposite side of the hilum. And then the efferent is the one that's going to take the fluid out. And we have more afferent than we do efferent, and that slows down the movement. Then it goes through the subcapsular space, network of fibers and dendritic cells. We go into the outer cortex that has B cells in the germinal centers. So here's the germinal centers. It goes through the lymph sinuses in the paracortex. These contain T cells. It goes into the medullary sinus at the core. This contains B cells and plasma cells. And then it goes out of the lymph node in the efferent lymphatics at the hilum and into the venous circulation. Okay, I have a few clinical disorders related to the lymphoid tissues and organs. So the mucus-associated lymphoid tissues defend the exposed epithelium in multiple tracts that are exposed to the exterior environment, as I've stated. And any infection or inflammation of these parts can cause a lot of problems. Tonsillitis being one example, the inflammation of the tonsils. Appendicitis, inflammation of lymphoid tissue in the appendix. Who's lost their appendix?
My 21st birthday.
So you lost your tonsils and your appendix.
I didn't have my tonsils.
Then,
out. I've
but you had
tonsillitis.
tonsillitis.
Yeah, I had appendicitis on my 21st birthday.
Okay.
So.
That's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when my son had appendicitis, he thought he was going to die.
Yeah, I thought so too.
Thymus size and function. So the thymus, remember, is up right above the heart, produces several hormones or thymosins. They're important for T cell development. The size and secretory abilities do decline with age. So right before puberty, the thymus is the largest, and it diminishes throughout time. By age 50, it can be less than 12 grams when it was about 40 grams before puberty. And this is correlated with increased susceptibility to disease. Now, it's not, I mean, it'd be great if it maintained all of its original function, but really, it's stated that by that time you probably have all of the T cells that you need anyway already formed and matured. So for the most part, it's not that big of an issue. So again, you see the thymus, you're right there above the heart, superior to the heart. Do not confuse it with the thyroid gland that's closer up to the neck area, the voice box. The thymus is located in the mediastinum, posterior to the sternum. It is covered in a capsule that divides it into left and right lobes. And the fibrous partitions are called septa, and this divides the lobes into lobules. Now, those of you in lab yesterday saw this in the cross section in the microscope, saw the individual lobules. Each is about 2 millimeters in diameter, so it's pretty large. You didn't have to go beyond the lowest power to see this. Each lobule has an outer cortex. In the outer cortex, you have divided lymphocytes in clusters around an epithelial reticular cell group. And this regulates the T cell development and function. The blood vessels in the cortex then are surrounded by epithelial cells, and this maintains the blood-thymus barrier. And then you have a lighter central medulla. Once T cells have developed, they leave the cortex. After about 3 weeks, they go into the medulla. And there's no blood thymus barrier in the medulla, so the developing T cells enter the medullary blood vessels. They can also enter the lymphatic vessel. They leave the thymus to the efferent lymphatic. The thymic epithelial cells form what's called the thymic corpuscle. These are very distinctive in shape, concentric layers. And this is what they look like. There's those concentric layers seen in the thymic corpuscle. And to put it in perspective, if you look in the upper picture in the lobule, you'll see those areas. Myasthenia gravis you may have heard of. This is an autoimmune disease. It's cause of enlarged hyperactive thymus. People with this have skeletal muscle weakness. And one of the reasons why is that the acetylcholine receptors at your neuromuscular junctions are destroyed. They're altered or they're blocked by antibodies that act against itself. So most autoimmune diseases, by the way, are going to be a reaction of your own antibodies against yourself, or what we call autoantibodies. Of course, there are certain autoimmune diseases that are cell-mediated, where it could involve T cells. But this one is associated with antibodies. And you'll remember from 168, acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that goes from one neuron to another, and then goes to the neuromuscular junction eventually. Okay, the spleen contains the largest mass of the lymphoid tissues in the body. It has the same function for blood that the lymph nodes do, basically filters. It removes abnormal red blood cells and other blood components by phagocytosis. It stores iron that's recycled from red blood cells. It initiates immune response by T cells and T cells when it responds to antigens in the circulating blood. Okay, so keep this in mind. It does perform the function for blood that lymph nodes do for lymph. One of the main characteristics. It lies along the curving lateral border of the stomach on the left side. It's attached to the lateral border of the stomach by the gastrosplenic ligament. The diaphragmatic surface is smooth and convex. It conforms to the shape of the diaphragm and the body wall. Here we have a transverse section that shows the diaphragmatic surface here of the spleen and its attachments. It shows the gastrosplenic ligament. It's about 5 inches long, weighs about 5.6 ounces. When it's dissected fresh, it's deep red because it has lots of blood in it, has a soft texture, and the shape is determined by whatever structures are around it. The visceral surface has 2 indentations, the gastric area near the stomach and the renal area near the kidneys. And then there is a hilum, which is an indentation where the blood and lymphatic vessels come into it or communicate with it. And this shows an inferior view of the spleen. It shows where the artery and vein come in and where the lymphatic vessels go in. Inside, we have an outer capsule of collagen and elastic fibers. The spleen is easily ruptured by impact. You've probably heard of this before. The tissue is very fragile to repair. And when there is damage, you may have to have a splenectomy or removal. Not uncommon for football players and people in other sports where they often get hit in the back to have some kind of spleen injury. And it's one of the reasons why you see a lot of the players now wearing special devices on the back for protection in those areas, in the lumbar area and higher up. Trabeculae, these are fibrous partitions that radiate outward from the hilum toward the capsule. This gives you room for the blood vessels. The pulp, these are cellular components in the capsule. It allows identification and removal of the microorganisms and the damaged or infected cells in the bloodstream. So we have both red pulp and white pulp. The red pulp has lots of red blood cells in it, like you might imagine, and it also has a lot of macrophages for phagocytosis. The white pulp looks like lymphoid nodules with lymphocytes. And here is a slide of the spleen. Notice from outside to inside you have the capsule, kind of more inner portions of trabeculae, the circular areas of white pulp, and surrounding that red pulp. So the flow of blood through the spleen, so we have trabecular arteries that are branches of the splenic artery. The finer branches are central arteries surrounded by the white pulp. So capillaries will discharge blood into the reticular tissue of the red pulp. That has free and fixed macrophages. Then blood flows into the sinusoids, where the walls contain fixed macrophages. And then blood collects into the small veins that in turn merge to form the trabecular veins that unite at the hilum. So if you have a ruptured spleen, this is an emergency. The spleen tears very easily, difficult to repair. In splenectomy, we remove the spleen. Without a spleen, you have increased risk for bacterial infection, but people do live without spleens. Now, let's talk about now the immune system now, and immunity. So immunity is the ability to fight infection, illness, disease. And there's two complementary mechanisms that work independently and together in the immune response. We have what's called the innate non-specific immunity. It doesn't distinguish one threat from another. It just knows that it doesn't belong there, that it's foreign. And the response is always the same. You're born with it. Again, we call it non-specific resistance. So basically, it's denying entry of these foreign microbes. It limits their spread. And it's also going to react against other environmental hazards that may get in. Anything that's an antigen that's seen as foreign, I mean, it doesn't have to be a living thing. In some examples, physical barriers, number one, this is the first line of defense really, skin and mucous membranes. And then you have phagocytes that are cycling around. They engulf pathogens and cell debris. In immune surveillance, you have natural killer cells that are destroying abnormal cells. You also have certain chemicals like interferons that work against viral infections. You have a group of chemicals called complement. These are circulating proteins that help antibodies. You also have basic inflammatory response or inflammation. This is localized tissue level response. And you have fever, which is elevation of your body temperature. And we'll talk more detail about each of those. So again, these are all innate, non-specific immunity. On the other hand, we have adaptive or specific. These recognize the threat, so they work against particular threats. And they are dependent on specific lymphocytes. So they produce specific resistance. Okay, so in this graphic you see the list of innate or non-specific immunity components. Okay, so again, what's the difference in innate immunity and adaptive? So what's innate first? Basically, you're born with it. Is it specific? is innate immunity specific or non-specific? Non-specific. So anything that your body perceives as foreign. And what's one of the first lines of defense in non-specific innate immunity? You know, like your skin, mucous membranes. What's some other examples, though, that was in that list of non-specific?
Phagocytes.
Sorry?
Phagocytes.
Okay, phagocytosis. What else? Fever.
Inflammation.
Basic inflammation, right? Okay. So let's talk about each of these in more detail. So the integumentary system, again, is that first line of defense. And your skin is a natural barrier itself, but it also produces secretions. So from the sebaceous and sweat glands, it's constantly washing away microorganisms and chemical agents. It also has bactericidal chemicals and destructive like enzymes like lysozymes. And there's also antibodies produced by the integumentary system. The hair provides protection from physical abrasion and prevents hazardous materials or insects from contacting the skin. Then you have your stratified squamous epithelium, which are just the multiple layers of the cells with keratin. I mean, it's just a physical barrier, but it makes a huge difference. And then you have other epithelial linings, like those that are found in the digestive and respiratory, urinary, reproductive tracts. The cells themselves provide a physical barrier, and they produce secretions like mucus, enzymes, stomach acids. They ensnare, destroy, wash away pathogenic material. And then alongside of these linings, you have mucus-associated lymphoid tissue for non-specific defenses. Okay, phagocytes engulf and destroy foreign substances and pathogens and any cellular debris. So we often say these are the first line of cellular defense against pathogenic invasion. They're going to attack and remove any foreign microorganisms before the lymphocytes even detect that they are there. At least that's what we hope will happen. Doesn't always work that way. And the different types target different threats. They all function basically the same way. So for example, neutrophils. These are in the bloodstream and tissues. There's lots of them. They're very mobile. They're fast acting. And they phagocytize cellular debris or bacteria. You remember when we studied the blood chapter, we said eosinophils, which are less abundant, phagocytize foreign compounds and any pathogens that have antibodies coating them. So by the way, this is one of the ways antibodies work, is by basically coating foreign things and basically putting up the flag and saying, come and get this foreign thing. We also have the monocyte macrophage system, also called the reticuloendothelial system. So in this case, we have the macrophages that come from monocytes, you might remember. You have fixed macrophages that are scattered in the connective tissues. They're basically immobile in the tissues. And then you have free macrophages that travel in your body. Now, phagocytes are able to leave your capillaries by squeezing between the endothelial cells. That's called immigration. Phagocytes also are able to be attracted or repelled by certain chemicals in the fluids. This is called chemotaxis. When your body cells release certain chemicals or pathogens release certain chemicals, it actually attracts these white blood cells. And phagocytosis always begins with adhesion. This is where it attaches to the target. This is an actual binding to the surface of the target. And after it adheres to it, this phagocyte can destroy the target or help promote the destruction by activating other defenses, which we'll talk about later on. I mean, one of the things a macrophage will do is to take in a foreign invader and redisplay its antigen on itself and get B cells involved. But we'll talk about that when we talk about specific immunity. Okay, immune surveillance. We have constant monitoring of the normal tissues by the natural killer cells. For the most part, your normal cells are going to be ignored, thank goodness. Cancer cells often contain tumor-specific antigens, and this is how natural killer cells know and recognize the abnormal cell. But natural killer cells will also recognize bacteria and other foreign cells, and even virus-infected cells, in addition to cancer cells. So these are the steps in the way natural killer cells recognize and destroy things. So you have unusual plasma membranes that activate the natural killer cells. They adhere to the target cells. Then the Golgi apparatus moves in the natural killer cell near the target cell. It produces secretory vesicles that have perforins. Then perforins are released from the natural killer cell and they go to the target cell. There's a close-up at the bottom showing that reaction of the secretory vesicles being released. Then the perforins create pores in the target cell, and the target cell can't maintain its internal environment. It disintegrates. So you're basically poking holes in it. So that's a natural killer cell operation. Natural killer cells also destroy abnormal cells, because you're always going to have some abnormal daughter cells that occur in cell division. And the problem is some of those abnormal cells could become cancer cells. So we usually take care of those before that happens. But as is true with most of our system, it's not a perfect process. Primary tumors can be surrounded by a capsule and escape detection. Some of your released malignant cells could be detected and destroyed though. And sometimes the daughter tumor cells don't display the tumor-specific antigens, or they're able to secrete chemicals that kill the natural killer cells. This is an adaptation that is not good, obviously, for the natural killer cells. So then the cancer cells can spread and create secondary tumors. So by the way, we really look at cancer as often a disease of the immune system, because the immune system's not doing what it's supposed to do, or somehow the cancer is evading the immune system. Okay, some other chemicals involved here though. Interferons you've probably heard of. Small proteins released by activated lymphocytes, macrophages, and virus-infected tissues. This triggers the production of antiviral proteins in the cytoplasm. It doesn't prevent entry of the viruses, but it does interfere with the viral replication. So you may have heard of people with certain types of virus infections, like certain hepatitis, that may get interferon injections to stimulate this killing. It stimulates activities of the macrophages and the natural killer cells. Okay, so this is an example of cytokine. Interferon is a cytokine. It's a chemical released by cells that coordinate local activities. But your body does produce interferons naturally. Again, it's an antiviral. There's 3 types: interferon A, or alpha, produced by the virus-infected cell itself. It attracts and stimulates natural killer cells. Can enhance resistance to viral infection. Interferon beta, secreted by the fibroblast. It can slow inflammation in the damaged areas. And interferon gamma, secreted by T cells and natural killer cells that stimulate macrophage activity. Okay, the complement system. This name refers to the fact the system complements the action of antibodies. And there's about 30 different proteins in the system. The proteins interact with each other in a chain reaction, or what we call a cascade. Very similar to the blood clotting system. And there's 3 pathways: the classical, the lectin, and the alternative pathway. In the classical pathway, this is the quickest, the most effective. The proteins attach to the antibody molecules that are bound to a pathogen. The attached proteins activate and initiate the cascade. It attaches other complement proteins, and you get a membrane attack complex. This destroys the integrity of the target cell. Okay, in the lectin pathway, this is activated by what we call the mannose-binding lectin protein. It binds to the carbohydrates on the bacterial surface. It activates inflammatory response. It also enhances phagocytosis, or what we call opsonization. So it makes macrophages and other phagocytes want to engulf that cell. In the alternative pathway, this is important against bacteria, some of the parasites, and virus-infected cells. There's a lot of complement proteins that interact in the plasma, and that interaction is triggered by exposure to foreign substances. The end result, attachment of the activated complement protein. But regardless, the effects are pretty much the same. You form a core, and this lyses the cell. It just makes that other cell leak. It destroys the integrity of that cell. An enhanced phagocytosis. This attracts the phagocytes and makes the target cell easier to engulf. Again, this is called opsonization. And then there's also histamine release. This is by the mast cells and basophil cells. It increases inflammation and blood flow to the region. Okay, so a lot of these things often in an inflammatory response, like histamine release, these things we're often fighting against, aren't we? You take antihistamines, for example, you do other things to fight inflammation, because often inflammation gives us these bad symptoms we don't like. But the unfortunate thing is those symptoms have a purpose often. But sometimes they do kind of go overboard. Okay, in inflammation or inflammatory response, the localized tissue responds to an injury by producing certain signs and symptoms. Redness, swelling, heat, pain, loss of function. What's the difference, by the way, in a sign and a symptom? So what's a sign versus a symptom?
Trick question.
Think about what a sign is in terms of roads.
Like it's telling you what is actually going on, the symptom can.
Okay, but what else? Like you're going to go take your road test. What do you do when you take a road test before you go on the road? What do you look through? You have to get the monitor and you look at the different signs, right? So it's something that's
Seen.
visual or seen. Okay, so that's a sign.
Sign is visual.
So what's a symptom?
Feel it.
Something you feel. And so generally something's not really measurable or observed. So is redness a sign or a symptom?
Sign.
Sign. How about swelling?
Sign.
Heat?
Symptom. No. Well, you would feel it. So
Right, it could be. It
so-
could go either way, right? But I mean, really, if there's real heat there, then it could be a sign. Pain.
Symptom.
Pain is definitely a symptom, right? Can you measure pain really?
They try to make you measure it at the hospital.
Right. The little smiley faces.
Most common number is 10.
Yeah. It's caused by various stimuli that kill cells, damages connective tissue fibers, injures tissues, causes a change in the chemical composition of the interstitial fluid. So what's really happening here is any of your damaged cells release a lot of different chemicals, prostaglandins being one of the main ones, and this is the one basically that causes pain. So some of your pain relievers work against this chemical. That's how a lot of anti-pain medicines work, is against the prostaglandins. But also they release proteins, they release potassium ions. The foreign proteins are pathogens, may have been introduced also. They're releasing certain chemicals, and all of these things trigger all of your white blood cells to react. And it also triggers other things in your tissues, whether it be vasoconstriction and things like that. So the damage itself releases lots of chemicals that cause inflammatory response. And one of the main things it shows here, mast cell activation, release of histamine and heparin from mast cells. Okay, so this shows a few things here. Redness, swelling, heat, pain. You have dilation of blood vessels, increased blood flow, increased vessel permeability, clot formation. Over here you have more phagocyte attraction, like neutrophils, and they themselves release more chemicals like cytokines, and this causes more removal of debris by neutrophils and macrophages that then stimulate fibroblasts and activation of other specific defenses that then initiate certain tissue repair mechanisms, pathogen removal, clot erosion, scar tissue formation. Fever, of course fever is a sign because you can measure that. Body temperature goes up above 99 degrees Fahrenheit or greater than 37.2 Celsius. What's responsible for this are pyrogens, which are chemicals. These are proteins. It resets the temperature thermostat in your hypothalamus. It raises your body temperature. And again, this is one of those things that can be quite beneficial to you. And these days, I think most of us know better, and we don't immediately try to turn down the fever. And as a matter of fact, unless our fever is really high, we generally don't even try to do anything about it. 103, I think now we're kind of considering as maybe the point at which we ought to do something. It could inhibit some viruses and bacteria, but one of the main things it does, it increases metabolic rate, it can accelerate tissue defenses, it repairs certain things, and it cuts off certain nutrient supplies to certain bacteria, we know now. Oh, so this is a summary of innate immunity. We talk about physical barriers that prevent the pathogens. We deny them access. We have phagocytes that remove debris and pathogens. We have immune surveillance that destroys abnormal cells. We have interferons that increase resistance of cells to viral infections. It slows the spread of disease. Okay, so this is a summary of those processes. We talk about the complement system. It attacks and breaks down the surface of cells, bacteria, and viruses. It attracts phagocytes. It stimulates inflammation. We talk about the multiple effects of inflammation and fever, which mobilizes the defenses. It accelerates repairs. It inhibits pathogens. And we will talk about adaptive immunity next time.